Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's panel. This is day one of the Afghanistan Symposium 20 years later. My name is Omar Aziz. I'm the director for the Middle Eastern Student Center at the University of California, Riverside. We are really thankful to have you here to join us for today's event. Today was the first day we kicked off the symposium. And a little bit about me, once again, I'm the director for the Middle Eastern Student Center at UC Riverside, and our center supports Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian, North African students on our campus, and we're so excited to bring this wonderful and amazing collection of scholars, journalists, and activists this week to speak on Afghanistan. As many of you may be aware, this week marks the 20th anniversary of when the first rockets were launched into Afghanistan from the United States in 2001. So we are grateful to be here. We know that for many of us, it's a privilege to be sitting here and to be talking and discussing this in the comfort of sort of where we are at this moment. But I also know a lot of people are deeply and directly impacted by what's happening in Afghanistan at this moment, whether that is with them, whether that's themselves, it's with family, loved ones, and friends. So we will hope to center, the people of Afghanistan in this conversation, and hopefully understand the history better and come out of this conversation with more context and awareness and tools to help us engage even further in Afghanistan and be more aware of what's happening. So I want to thank Dr. Ali Olomi today for his keynote presentation, talking a little bit about the history of Afghanistan and some of the recent conflicts and kind of talking about what has led us to where we are today and what led to where we were to that point in 2001. So we're going to have a panel of folks here today to continue that conversation and expand on that. So as we're talking, as we're speaking, please make sure you are commenting on YouTube, asking questions, going to our social media page. We have the hashtag AFGUCR and hashtag AFG Symposium if there's anything you've learned or taken away from it. So please encourage you to use it. And I will go ahead and start us off by introducing our esteemed panel today. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Dr. Marya Hanun, who is a historian of Afghanistan and the Middle East. She received her bachelor's in 2009 from Columbia University's Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies and her PhD from Georgetown University's Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. Her dissertation explored the role of women, trans-regional networks, and Islamic reform in early 20th century Afghan state formation. She's currently the Qatar postdoctoral fellow at Georgetown Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Then we have Dr. Shah Mahmoud Hanifi from James Madison University. Dr. Hanifi is a professor of history at James Madison, where he teaches on the Middle East and South Asia. Dr. Hanifi's publications have addressed subjects including colonial political economy and intellectual history, Pashto language, photography, cartography, animal and environmental studies, and Orientalism in Afghanistan. He serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Afghanistan and is a special theme editor on Afghanistan for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Asian History. So welcome, Dr. Hanifi and Dr. Hanun. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Ali Olomi, Assistant Professor of Middle East and Islamic History at Penn State Abington and an affiliated scholar with Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. He researches medieval thought and modern Muslim political movements. His scholarship examines the way Muslims imagine the world around them through the intersection of religion and science and empire and identity. He has lectured nationally and internationally on Muslim politics, U.S. involvement in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and Islamic history. So I am here to be a little bit of a fly on the wall on this brick wall behind me because we have such an amazing group. I have tasked Dr. Olomi to kind of help moderate and lead our discussion. We want nothing more than to learn and hear from this esteemed panel of historians because nothing more interesting than hearing from you all. I told them I want to be a fly on the wall and want to hear from you all and hear about all the amazing work that you're doing and the great insight that you have. So I will go ahead and take it away for Dr. Olomi.
Thanks, Omar. It's a pleasure to be back, and I'm very excited to be talking with Dr. Hanun and Dr. Hanifi about a very important and unfortunately quite timely conversation about the history of Afghanistan. We're going to kind of go back and forth with a series of questions, but this is a very loose format. with the hope and desire being that it's going to be a free-flowing conversation, providing some historical context into what the contemporary situation is looking like. So with that, we're going to actually start with Dr. Hanifi, which is kind of a question, and then we'll turn to Dr. Hanun with the same question. How does Afghanistan's present shape its or how does Afghanistan's past shape its present, or how does its history help us understand what is currently going on? So I'm going to turn this over to you, Dr. Hanifi.
Well, thanks for the easy question first. That's of course a very large and complex question. The first thing I would focus on is the language of the question itself, where there's a singular past and a singular thing called Afghanistan. And that would be the first thing I would want to kind of unpack a bit, in that the past has many different layers. Some of them change at different speeds. Geographic history changes much slower than political and cultural history, of course. So I think the complexity of the past needs to be reckoned with. And so also Afghanistan as a singular thing does have a past as a singular entity, perhaps international relations or diplomatic history or something, where the state is the focus. But historically, Afghanistan is not a singular thing. It's composed of many parts. Even geographic regions have distinct histories to places outside of the geography of Afghanistan. The question of their relationships, if we just take the four major cities, historically, they relate, at least the record indicates they're relating much more to cities other than those in the current boundaries of the country, in many ways. And so I think the question then becomes, what does the formal period of Afghanistan's history being on the map do to that previous set of histories? And so I think that's the challenge. It would be which era of history and which region of Afghanistan is affected, and how to answer the question in any specific way.
I can just jump right in, and
Please.
I can echo Dr. Hanifi. I think there's often a sort of impulse to ask historians to explain the present as if there's some single narrative that can sort of encapsulate the complexities of Afghanistan, both geopolitically and in all of its sort of local fabric. And I think that it's been interesting, I'll just say on a sort of personal note, over the past several weeks, to have sort of experienced those questions again and again, put to myself in my own work. And I would say that, I think we can't understand the present without understanding the past. There's often an impulse in the sort of political discourse of the present to approach Afghanistan ahistorically, or simply through the lens of the past 20 years. And this is obviously a really flawed way of looking at Afghanistan, as you yourself have spoken about a lot in the past several weeks as well. But having said that, I would echo Dr. Hanifi's sort of statement that there isn't a singular narrative or a simple way of encapsulating sort of the past of Afghanistan that will tell us what, we want to know today.
Yeah, I thank you both for a very important point, and a reminder of how complicated talking about the multiplicities of the past can really be. And so to that end, we're going to do the best that we can to untangle some of these aspects of the past. So let's start with Dr. Hanun, kind of diving in a little bit further in the 20th century. Can we talk a little bit about the way that women's movement in the 20th century gets us to where we are today? Can we talk about women's rights and women's movements beyond what's happening just in the past 20 years, but really look to the 20th century a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's again a really important question, and I think there's sort of a historical methodological answer, and it's important to look at the past and women's rights in Afghanistan within this longer context, not just to understand sort of how we got here today, but also in terms of just sort of thinking about and relating and how we perceive and talk about Afghan women's rights today. I think the past has a lot to teach us. And as we all know, women's rights and the rights of Afghan women and girls have been so central to the discourse of intervention over the past 20 years. And often this has been, as Leila Abu Ghur sort of famously wrote in 2003, but we've seen again and again, has often manifested as a very ahistorical depiction of sort of the Taliban abuses of women in the 90s as something that sort of was about culture, Islam over there, that had nothing to do with this wider network of in which the Taliban emerged and in which women existed over the past decades. Also, within this narrative of women's rights today, they're often viewed, and over the past 20 years, women are viewed in this sort of monolithic, singular definition of women and women's rights in ways that don't actually engage women broadly, and again, sort of serve imperial interests and interests of the occupying forces over the past 20 years. And I think what's interesting for me as a historian of women and women's rights and women in the state in Afghanistan is that women's rights have sort of been central to debates about modernity and progress and authority and political legitimacy since the early years of the Afghan state. So it's often dated sort of historiographically to the era of Amanullah Khan and 1919 and his reforms to women. But, even before, during the reign of Abdurrahman Khan in the late 19th century, the protection of women was drawn under the authority of the state. Women's honor was situated as being under, the protection of the state. And social practices impacting women, such as their rights in marriage and divorce, were a focal point in that period of legal decrees. So even in the 19th century, we see this sort of authority coming in of the state trying to speak for women and protect women in a way that is sort of projecting its authority. And I think this tells us very little about women's lived experiences in the territory that we know of Afghanistan. It tells us about how the state talks about women and women's rights, their everyday lives and the violence or the triumphs that they experienced under Abdurrahman, whether, we talk about the sort of internal colonization of areas like Hazarjat and the way that Hazara women were enslaved or became concubines as it was captured, or whether we talk about the sort of triumphs of women intellectuals like Aisha Durrani, who famously wrote a divan that was published during Abdurrahman's reign, or we have access to some sources from Kunar, the court records during this period in which we see women navigating the court system in order to dissolve their marriages or sort of access their rights within this sort of emerging legal framework. But these sources just tell us about the diversity of women's lived experiences. And as many sources as we have sort of a different idea of what it means to be an Afghan woman. And that really sort of complicates any simple narratives that come from the state, even as they're sort of affiliated with the state making projects. And so I think in the 1920s, which is the period I focus on in my work, we see the same tension between women's rights as a sort of discursive frame and then women's social lives. So this was a time when women's education was a source of enormous contention between Amanullah Khan, who was the king in that period, and the Kabuli intelligentsia, political actors in Kabul and other parts of the country who were opposed to women's schooling. And when we read the newspapers and look at the archival material that comes from the state, a lot of it centers around these debates and the sort of contentions around women's rights, debates about women's rights. And it's even, referred to as women's rights, hukuk niswan. And these are reduced to a battleground upon which men are contesting authority. And I think this is interesting because women's voices and their actions and the complexity around women's organizing and the diversity among women as political actors really gets overlooked. And so when we move beyond these debates and study women's political participation within the state building project, women who had access to the state's resources, like Soraya Tarzi, who was the wife of Aminullah Khan and the daughter of the reformist intellectual Mahmoud Tarzi, as well as the first generation of women who were educated in Kabul, like other historical actors in the period, and as would intuitively make sense, these women benefited from their proximity to power to carve out space for their political participation. And in what I sort of think of as the first women's movement by the sort of political scientific definition of women's movements in the region at the time. And while they were connected to the state, they weren't just acting on behalf of the state. So when we locate their voices, we see how in many ways their demands diverged from the official state policy towards women, how their participation was not always secular or Western in orientation, but often rooted in Islamic reform and trans-regional networks. So again, a lot of what we call the first women's movement in Afghanistan, or what we could call the first women's movement, was rooted in a reinterpretation of Islam. The first girls' school, which I studied the textbooks from, their texts were often based in religious studies and diniyat in the Hanifi tradition. The home economic textbooks were not coming from Western Europe. They were coming from Indian Muslim women who were writing about what the ideal Muslim woman and housewife would be. And I think this matters because looking to the substance of what women were doing and learning and talking about rather than the debates around them forces us to ask a sort of different set of questions about the nature of women's political participation, their relationship to the state, to other women in society, but also to their exclusion and the sort of role that we cast both Islam and the state in playing in their exclusion. And this was true in the Soviet period as well. I read an interview with Timothy Noonan recently, who wrote the book Humanitarian Invasion, on this period of Soviet rule in Afghanistan. And he speaks about locating women as actors in this period beyond the Soviet state and its sort of discursive appropriation of women's emancipation, and finding that while women benefited in some ways from the Soviet approach to women's rights, they often put forward a different set of concerns that didn't fit neatly within these frameworks. And so I think this isn't to say that women's organizing is only legitimate when it's sort of indigenous or authentic, whatever that means, but just that I think it teaches us to not have a sort of a priori assumption about what women want and what constitutes women's rights in Afghanistan or really anywhere. And just the diversity of women's lived experiences, their competing interests and loyalties is so vast. So I guess historically and today, my sort of lesson is it's really important to avoid this impulse to reduce or collapse women's rights and citizenship and social participation within these. And I think this sort of historically and today, I can say, in the past, in the period that I study, and what I see sort of happening today is it has a tendency to reduce or collapse women's rights and serve patriarchal authority or patriarchal systems, whatever they be, whether they be the state or international coalition forces or the Taliban. And so, I think that that's my sort of lesson from my work on the past.
Thank you, Dr. Hanun. That was fascinating. And I think in particular, you're mentioning, for example, the transnational networks and the Islamic reform movements that shaped what you were studying as well, really brings up our kind of next question for Dr. Hanifi, which is really to kind of think about Afghanistan without the concept of borders. And you hinted a little bit at this at the beginning when you talked about the sort of four major cities and how that past that supposedly links them together is far more complicated. So I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about how to think about Afghanistan without the concept of borders, perhaps transnational, perhaps a different framework. But why do you think why do you think it's important to think of Afghanistan in that way? and what can we learn from that particular framing?
Well, again, thanks for the question. I think the question about borders is to ask where they come from and whose interest are they serving. What are their effects? And, you know, the concept of border as a kind of modern administrated line has some parallels in deeper historical eras. In the pre-modern era, there are kinds of boundaries, and they could be natural, a river or a kind of frontier zone. So there's nothing really kind of alien about the idea of a border per se. But in Afghanistan's case, we need to ask what are the agencies for creating them? And they're largely imperial, non-Afghan. And so then the question becomes, you know, whose borders are these really? And what are they doing for whom and how, you know? And the, you know, way to then explore this is maybe in three ways, where we can think of the period of creating those borders. Perhaps we can call this the second half of the 19th century broadly. Mm-hmm. There was a process. The borders were segmented and took shape at different times with different actors, international kind of actors involved. So the process of those borders is one area to consider. The borders themselves have different effects for those on either side of each border. And the main border, I think, that is most recognized would be the border named after a British imperial official, mm-hmm. not an Afghan, the Durand Line, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan today. And that there's been kind of a misreading in a number of ways about that border somehow dividing the Pashtun tribes evenly. And this is, the borders mean different things to Afghanistan and Pakistan. The northern part of the border feels and looks very different historically and culturally than the southern section of the border. You know, the border doesn't inhibit crossings. And so we can unpack each of the various borders of the country in this way by really exploring the context of its formation and the effect of it. But it's a little more fun for me, at least. I'm being sucked into the deeper historical eras because of my interest in environmental history. And so I'm spending more time thinking about the period before these borders. And Afghanistan as a political entity has a very tangible history prior to the late 19th century. Mm-hmm. And so Afghanistan, in very specific terms, has a pre-bordered political past. And then, of course, the transition to a bordered political entity out of that, the Ahmad Shah Durrani Empire, you know, giving way to this bordered Afghanistan. And so that sort of the history period confined to the Afghan state structure would be one way to periodize this. But as we start going back in time, we start seeing some really important connections that Afghanistan has to the surrounding world. And many of the things that we take for cultural granted as being constitutive of who we are as Afghans. And we can say Islam, you know, comes from outside of the borders of Afghanistan. And of course, it's been indigenized and domesticated and becomes a big part of Afghan identity, so to speak. But the process of that is, you know, it's a pre-bordered process. That's not to say that there aren't boundaries and frictions of a modern sort or something, but and other religions and deeper pre-Islamic Buddhism comes from outside and leaves a incredible residue in the middle of the country. And it's really the borders, just in principle, thinking of Afghanistan as a singular, distinct entity conceptually disconnects it from its surroundings. And it's actually those connections that give the country its cultural fabric. And, when we think of not even just religions, but languages, the things that we take for cultural granted, the Persian language has a history and that's very much outside of the geography of Afghanistan. And of course, that's not to say that we can all claim that modern Persian was born, so to speak, in Afghanistan, Ghazni, Ferdowsi, writing Persian with the Arabic script. That happens in Afghanistan, and we can certainly say that there's a, indigenous Persian history there, but it's the wider connections of the Persianate world that are, trump that singular locality. And, I would say also the same thing for Pashto, which has its indigeneity. But if we think of when Pashto was first written, it gets written by Khushal Khan Khattak outside of the border of Afghanistan. So what do we do with that spatial disjuncture? And, the borders tend to focus, tend to eliminate focus on us, the diaspora outside of Afghanistan. And it's really the connections between in the modern border case, between the diaspora and, but we can look at the presence historically of Afghans well outside of the borders of Afghanistan, making considerable historic difference, shall I say, in contexts like the Mughal Empire. And so in general, I think the borders can really mislead us about the mobility that has informed Afghanistan's past and the connections. And so, I think it's important in a sense, just mentioning the Mughal Empire, we can say that that's not necessarily external to Afghanistan, because the founder, Babur, is buried in Kabul and is more or less fell in love with Kabul and wrote about it. And, and so the Mughal does have a very tangible presence inside the country, but Babur's history, he was informed. Afghanistan made him into who he was, and then he left, And so what do we do with that? And look at all of our political leaders who have had these extraterritorial experiences and bring them. Name one leader that doesn't have connections outside of the country would be the kind of way to ask that rhetorically, right? And we don't have to look at the most recent two or the current group. Most of them historically, the founder of the entity that became Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah, Abdali, born in Multan, sort of Mashhad, Iran. It makes his coming of age was outside of Afghanistan's territorial borders, so to speak. And that's not to say that Kandahar is not a relevant location in that formation and his burial in Kandahar. But the point is really the rest of his political, sociological, and cultural experiences. Broadly, then, It's very important, I think, for the audience to appreciate that the bordering of Afghanistan was really something that non-Afghans initiated. The British, in a very basic sense, we can just leave that there for the moment, but the Afghan rulers who did these borders got paid. They got paid to establish a border which inhibited, in each case, inhibited movements and connections that historically give the economy vibrancy, for example. And so closing off Afghanistan's natural economic connections led to the impoverishment that we take for granted today. And the question becomes is, as an Afghan, where did our food go? And historically, we had been able to feed ourselves. And the people invested in the borders that are invested in policing them on our behalf have also deprived us of the resources inside our borders. The people who are invested in these borders want to keep us inside the borders. Afghanistan, stay there, stay there, stay there. Don't come here. You don't have your pass. You don't have your visa. No. But they can come anytime they like with the privilege of a drone or however they want to express themselves. And so I'm not sure if these, in fact, I can say definitively, these borders have been harmful to Afghanistan in many tangible ways. And we can also celebrate the map and we can be proud of the territory. And this isn't to say, but it's to ask about, what is this Wakhan corridor thing? Why does it look like Cyprus? And there's nothing natural here with this configuration, And so maybe that's, I think, some initial thoughts on borders.
Thank you, Dr. Hanifi. I think that's such a crucial and important reminder. I think the thing that really struck out to me was the way that you talked about borders as disconnecting, right? The way that the borders actually disrupt, but also to raise the question of borders for who. Afghans are bound by the border, but are other people who are able to move through those borders without it. Dr. Hanun, it's when you were talking about the transnational networks that women drew upon in their activism, particularly the women's movement, it was quite striking to me, and I think this is where these two conversations really come in with each other, is how that those transnational networks also exist in, for example, the Deobandi movement. Right. So when you were able to start to think transnationally, or you were able to think beyond those borders, you're able to do a more robust analysis of something like the group like the Taliban. Right. Where does Deobandi as an Islamic revivalist movement emerge from, and how does that shape that particular movement? So I see very much, for people who are following along, these two are having a conversation with one another without intentionally, like this was not on no intention, but there's a way that this conversation is linking up. Yeah.
I will say, I was trained in part by Professor Hanifi, and one of the first essays that he had me read was by David Liddon called Maps in the Mind, and it was an address to the Association for Asian Studies. And this moment in the essay that has always stuck with me is this notion that we imagine that borders came first and that all mobility is transgressing borders. And I think one of the things that it has really taught me is to think about, in some ways, when we study the history of Afghanistan, we're really studying how these borders came to matter and be reinforced, and a lot of the violence that entailed. And it's something that we see again and again, and we saw it, in August with people trying to leave the country and being unable to, and these borders being closed to them. But it's not a new problem. So I think there's a reason that we have this sort of similar conversation. I do think that in order to understand, really get a full picture of the history, even of the Afghan nation state as a nation state, even if that's your object of historical inquiry, you have to understand and look beyond and look at how it was produced, and also the role that trans-regional networks really played in that production. and some of the disjunctures that were caused by that. So for the women that I study, in some ways, the trans-regional mobilizing that they were engaged in put them at odds with some of the more local connections that might have been important or might have been able to speak to different concerns of women in society across Afghan society versus what the big debates about women were in the pan-Islamic press at the time in the 20s. So.
Yeah, and that really invites, and this is a bit of a broad question, so feel free to narrow it down in whichever way you think is more productive, Dr. Hanun. But in your opinion, what do you think people get wrong about our understanding of women and women's history in Afghanistan? Because, as you rightly pointed out, there is a great deal of misconception, and Abu Ghod's work of Do Muslim Women Need Saving is one really kind of important intervention in that regards of our misunderstanding of women's movements and women's rights in Afghanistan. So this is a bit of a broad question. Feel free to take it in a direction that you think is more productive. But what do you think we get wrong when we talk about women in Afghanistan, women's history and women's rights?
I mean, I think that sort of, again, the biggest sort of gap, I would say, is that there isn't a lot of attention to the complexity of women as historical actors and the diversity of women. We have this really overarching need for some reason, and this goes back to Layla Abu Lughat's critique, to define the Afghan woman in a particular way. And really understand Afghan women in, as if that's something that can be simply done or possible. But I think another corrective, and one I've been thinking about lately, is also how gender operates in all of this besides women, like how the obsession with Afghan women sort of discursively obscures some of the other kinds of gendered modes of inquiry when looking at Afghanistan. So even just to take Layla Abu Lughat's critique of saving Afghan women, the flip side of that obsession with saving Afghan women is the vilification or the disregard of Afghan men and the sort of violence associated with Afghan masculinity and Pashtun masculinity. So saving women from what, we have to ask. And I think historically we see some of these same ideas or maybe echoes of these ideas of violent masculinity, especially tied to borderland regions in the 1920s, areas that were subject to heavy aerial bombardment, like the regions between Afghanistan and British India, that sort of dovetailed with ideas about Afghan masculinity as well. That the space was masculine, that it was violent, that the only way the people could respond, the only kind of authority they would respond to was violent authority. And so I've been asking myself how similar violent imaginings of men, it's hard not to think about how those were deployed in the drone warfare over the past 20 years and how we define what kind of collateral damage is acceptable and who's counted as a victim versus a combatant in these 20 years of war. So I guess like within this sort of focus on women, where do men fit in as victims in conflict, as historical actors beyond the sort of state and military, how families and relationships between men and women are all questions that are not asked of Afghan history very often. And there are exceptions. There are people doing great work, people like James Karen, who've written really wonderfully about this, but they're really the exceptions. And as someone who came to the study of Afghanistan from, Middle Eastern history, these are very well trodden arenas of gender and women's studies in the Middle East. And so I guess maybe I'm rambling a bit, but I think the study of Afghanistan really and Afghan women, it's somehow not a coincidence that this oversimplification of Afghan women and the related or corollary sort of reduction of Afghan men is part of a bigger problem in which we don't really think about the complexities of Afghan identity, humanity, and gender within the sort of whole field of study. Yeah,
that's fantastic. And I think your ability to connect that lack of complexity to the way that it sometimes serves imperial interests, right? Whether it's, saving Afghan women or who even gets counted as the casualties of, say, drone warfare, right? And we certainly see that language even now, with what will happen to Afghan women being the primary question, particularly as it's juxtaposed against a militant or construction of militant Afghan masculinity, right? Pashtun masculinity as being inherently violent and restrictive. And I think this offers an opportunity, and we can start with Dr. Hanifi, and then of course Dr. Hanun, if you'd want to talk a little bit about the way in which the language of tribalism shapes a lot of the discourse around Afghanistan, and how it makes it somehow uniquely ungovernable. This is the language that we hear quite a bit. It ties in to some extent to the question of the rural versus urban divide. But we see this in particular in sort of the analysis of quote unquote what went wrong, right? Is that Afghanistan is inherently ungovernable, and that there was a difference between Kabul and what's going on in the sort of tribal areas. So if we want to talk a little bit about, when people talk about Afghanistan can't have a functioning state because of that tribal structure, what's the truth there? What is the, what does history offers us as a sort of lens to push back on, say, that overly simplistic understanding of Afghanistan as inherently ungovernable because it is a tribal structure? So we'll start with Dr. Hanifi, and I think you've touched on some of these themes a little bit, and then we'll get some comments from you as well, Dr.
Hanun. Well, I think so much of the although it's proportionally small, as Dr. Hanun mentioned, in relation to the field of Middle Eastern studies or South Asian studies, the literature on Afghanistan is minuscule. Now, the history of those who have studied Afghanistan in the modern era, particularly in the American context, are preponderantly anthropologists prior to 9/11, let's say. Mm-hmm. And it's the discipline of anthropology that's kind of been the disciplinary home for tribal studies, so to speak. Now, anthropology has its own disciplinary history that's tied immediately and explicitly to colonialism and imperialism. And now we're back to understanding Afghanistan, not its borders as imperial products, but the tools for understanding Afghanistan as colonial and imperial frames of reference. And so, for example, the British Empire in other parts of the world, particularly India, but the Middle East and Africa, dealt with tribes. Mm-hmm. These happened to be Muslim tribes. A lot of these Muslim tribes were, let's just say rural and mobile, and all the things that sort of modern industrial capitalism is not, or that is focused in urban centers of capital concentration, where labor can be kind of organized and surveilled. And like tribal mobility is something empires don't like. Mm-hmm. And even modern empires, moving was dangerous in Afghanistan for 20 years with the global surveillance network, and the casualty list for people who were just merely moving indicate how problematic just tribal economies are. Pastoralism is for states to navigate, and they can try to tax and have, sort of checkpoints and passes and, that kind of identity cards. But in general, the idea of a recalcitrant tribe that's mobile and Muslim has an imperial epistemology. And that gets routed in concrete terms to the area of Afghanistan now, where the reduction of the complexity. Tribalism is, first of all, a very complex formation, like democracy. There's different kinds and expressions here. The anthropologists say there are some tribes that think of all of themselves as equal, egalitarian tribes. They also say that there are chieftaincies, conical tribes with a leader. So some tribes identify a leader, And some tribes sort of the leader for the moment, or wherever it can muster consensus, situational leadership. Okay, so we need to appreciate that insight from anthropology, that there's not one kind of tribe in Afghanistan. Okay, and to reduce, therefore, and this is typically the case, that the version of tribalism that's in question here is Pashtun tribalism. And then this gets sort of reified in Pashtun Wali, which is the tribal code. Okay, and this is supposed to be now the distinctly Pashtun way of doing things. And let's call these things regulating mobility, such as granting asylum, maintaining some kind of honor and revenge. Now, the questions we need to start asking is, what groups don't have some form of hospitality or refuge or honor or revenge? And isn't 9/11 kind of, it's revenge? I mean, it's 20 years of violent revenge. And so we can't assume that this thing called Pashtun Wale, whatever it might be, and there's disagreement about what the sort of the vocabulary and the concepts involved here are, how many of these things there are, but as if we must appreciate that non-Pashtuns also have senses of hospitality and honor. And let's kind of start to appreciate that. And, you know, what's the trick to capture some of Afghanistan's diversity? As Marya was referencing women, and in the sort of the vacancy, the hollowness of that category, until we start saying, what women are we talking about? Are we talking about literate women? Are we talking about urban women, elite women, women that are ethnically what? What are the, how international are they? What are we speaking of, therefore, when we say saving the Afghan women? Is it actually just girls of school age? Is it women? Is it actually octogenarian? Are we worried about the 80-year-old Afghan grandmother? Or are we worried about the 16-year-old? I mean, and what is the point then applies also to men and the genderness, where it's mainly urban, preponderantly, not exclusively, of course, Persian-speaking women that are the object of the much of the discourse. And the sort of antithesis of that is the men who are rural, who are Pashtun men. And so to save the urban Persian woman, we have to exterminate the rural Pashtun. What is this? And so, again, I think it's important to not just think beyond the boundaries of Afghanistan, think beyond the categories and the boundaries of the categories that we are applying here. And so maybe that's a few comments on that.
No, I think that's a really crucial and important points that you've made there, Dr. Hanifi. Dr. Hanun, did you want to add anything to that before we take some questions from the audience?
I mean, just to sort of echo something that Professor Hanifi said about this framing, and I think I think my sort of I do feel that both this notion of the tribe and tribalism is something that sort of is appended to rural Afghanistan and in opposition to the state and is sort of static. Has been, you know, we see it in the way even, you know, Joe Biden, like you were saying, justified the sort of ungovernability of Afghanistan. And I think this dichotomy between rural and urban that Dr. Hanifi mentioned is really interesting. And also, I'm sort of seeing in a lot of the media around Afghanistan over the past few weeks an emphasis on this dichotomy, but again, in ways that feel very simplistic, that reproduce some of the same sort of simple narratives for viewing Afghanistan. And so I think just an area that I want to underscore is, even when we talk about women and rural versus urban women, that's only one axis of difference among so many. And when we talk about women's rights or whether women have gained or lost, and there's sort of this emphasis on women in the urban centers having gained during these 20 years of intervention. But what does it mean to be an urban Afghan woman, or even a woman of Kabul? It's a city of 5 million. It includes urban poor and IDPs and Hazara neighborhoods and transgender women. And so can there be like even a single urban woman's experience of war? And so I think, if nothing else, maybe the refrain I will keep pushing is just for rejecting some of these overly simplistic narratives for understanding or explaining state failure in Afghanistan, and explaining the failure of a very ill thought out and, sort of horrifying military intervention of 20 years in ways that blame Afghans and sort of blame a very simplistic reading of Afghan society.
Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions here from the audience, so we're going to turn to those. This was a really robust and interesting conversation. The first comes to us from Professor David Lloyd, who's at UCR. So hello, thank you for joining us. He says, first, thanks to Mace for this remarkable and informative conversation. It's always great to learn so much. Here's the question. Afghanistan has all too often been described as a quote-unquote failed state. Given all that has been said this evening of the colonial imposition on Afghanistan's borders and the ways that they have broken up the region and disconnected Afghans from their historic interconnections with other peoples, would the panelists think that any future for Afghanistan, and I think, let me see if I can bring up the comments real quick, disconnect Afghans from their historic interconnections with other people, would the panelists think that any future for Afghanistan, so it's unfortunately broken here, we'll just assume that he's talking about some type of future that goes beyond that disconnect, there we go, would have lied beyond the state from and by imagining other forms of organizing and social and communal life. So thinking beyond the kind of borders, the imposition, and thinking beyond the state here. Let's start first with Dr. Hanun, and then we'll go over to Dr. Hanifi for this question. Thank you for this fantastic question, Professor Lloyd.
Thanks for giving me the hard one.
Yeah.
Right? I will say, I do think any future for Afghanistan, a sort of harmonious one, has to contend with many of the factors that we have been discussing, whether they be the sort of, real diversity of Afghan society, the extractive disconnect between urban centers and those with authority and rural so-called peripheries, that they will have to contend with the violence of these regimes. And I think what we're seeing today is not it doesn't inspire a great deal of optimism, but I think that, and I don't have a good answer about what form the state should take, except to say that the sort of erasure of the social fabric, the complexity, and parts of society like women, who themselves represent a very diverse segment of Afghan society, are not will not produce, I think, a unified and harmonious state apparatus or society. But
yeah, thank you. Dr. Hanifi, I think you mentioned particularly in the ways to talk about the history of Afghanistan is to imagine it beyond these borders, to think about the history beyond even to some extent the state formation. So do you think that there is a way of imagining other forms of organizing and social and communal life beyond that of the imposed border or beyond that of the state?
Well, first, let me say how nice it was to see a question from David Lloyd, whose collective with Swan Radio has my maximal respect. And to think of that synergy at Riverside makes me want to move there if there's no fires. So I really applaud your sharing each other's programming space. So a couple of things. First of all, it's let's just take the state first, okay? And we tend to see historically the state as we know it with borders and a kind of coercive mechanism and a bureaucracy taking shape under Abdurrahman in the late 19th century, okay? And that period is one of carnage for the Afghan people in a lot of ways, okay? That's colonially funded violence in many ways, but it's perpetrated by an Afghan leader. And what happens historically then is that the distance between Afghan rulers and Afghan, the word citizen is so rarely used to say, we talk about the Afghan state. What's a state do? It creates citizens. No one talks about citizenry in Afghanistan, what that obligations and rights are. But that notwithstanding, kind of since Abdurrahman, you had two choices. One, try to connect yourself to what the state had to offer, maybe for education scholarships, or two, avoid it at all costs and stay away from it. And so the failure of the Afghan state is in not kind of integrating enough of the citizenry in the first instance. It's still a failed state is different than a weak state maybe here, but the structure has always been thin. Perhaps the Afghan people have not been legible to the state in another way of viewing this conceptually. The problem here, though, conceptually still, is that you can't have it both ways. You can't have a failed state that's apparently also a state that's Pashtun dominated. Because something that dominates, such as a state, does so effectively. If you're a dominant state, you can't be a failed state. So it's one or the other here in terms of those categories fitting together, Pashtun domination or the failed state. They don't match. Okay. Maybe I'll just say finally about the state. The state, as we kind of know it in Afghanistan, has not been a redistributive mechanism. It's a rentier state structure that's funded by the outside. And who that state is working for is quite another question about the failure here. So in a sense, I'd like to refract the failure from the locality to the system. The failure of the Afghan state's a failure of its patrons.
That's really a powerful statement there, and it really brings to mind the Afghanistan Papers, that just kind of massive expose that was released in the past couple of years that talks exactly about what you were talking about, the failure of the patrons, right? Billions of dollars flushed into Afghanistan. Where does it actually end up? We have a question from a UCR student, and I think this is a great question to kind of end this conversation on a little bit. We are at the 1 hour mark, and I want to respect everyone's time. Even though this is such a robust and interesting conversation, I think we could go on for hours. But UCR student Maymuna Navid says, what are your thoughts on the state of women's rights at this moment, and where do you see it going given the current situation? So I think this is a really great conversation or a question for Dr. Hanun.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's a very important one. And I mean, I think along with many Afghan women and others, I have a lot of concerns about women's rights under this new Taliban government. We're still waiting to see what will happen with women's education. There's a lot that is uncertain. And I think if this conversation, as I've mentioned in this conversation, we can't ignore the status of Afghan women. We can't look away, and we also can't separate it from the larger social fabric of Afghanistan. And so things like women's education and women's right to political participation and peaceful demonstration go hand in hand with things like the media being able to report on these things as well, which we're also not seeing as robustly. And so I'm concerned about what we do know, and it's been hard to see. I also think that it's really, really crucial not to repeat the mistakes of the past and not to sort of uncritically just collapse women's rights, or even the sort of perpetuate an uncritical narrative of the Taliban and its policies towards women as existing outside of the last 20 years, outside of larger geopolitical and historical forces. And so I think we, in sort of examining the present, we can't forget the past and the legacy of the past 20 or 40 or 100 years when we talk about women's rights today. And I think one sort of more, I don't want to say optimistic, because I won't predict the future. Like, I really don't know what will come. But one sort of piece of optimism or piece of hope that I have for my own work is that there, in the end of the 1920s, the women's schools, the girls' schools in Kabul were closed. And this sort of period of a state-centered women's rights that existed in the 1920s came to an end, ostensibly. But if you follow women's biographies, and if you follow women as historical actors, the women who were part of these educational institutions, you find them continuing to work and to organize and to educate even underground. And I think we saw a similar dynamic in the 90s. And so this doesn't tell us about women's rights writ large, but it does tell us that women's consciousness, their political consciousness, their education, it doesn't just disappear because they're forced to occupy different spaces in society. And I think we've seen that already in some of the, in what we have seen on social media and what we have seen in terms of women speaking out and demonstrating. And so that's my sort of hopeful note from my work in the midst of everything else.
And I think that hopeful note is probably the best place that we can perhaps leave it. I want to take a moment to thank both yourself, Dr. Hanun, and Dr. Hanifi, for your insightful and thoughtful commentary. I learned a lot, and I'm a historian of this region. I know that everyone else did, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in, who took the time to chat with us. This was a very interesting and engaging conversation with both of you, and hopefully the beginning of a more long-term discussion about Afghanistan. I think one of the things that we all are kind of keenly aware of is that when tragedy strikes, or when the crisis is right at the forefront of public memory, these conversations happen, but then they kind of percolate and they kind of disappear into the shadows, or end up hiding behind a conference room in some academic, corner of the world without the public really paying attention to it. So thank you for having this very important conversation. I'm going to turn this over to our wonderful host, Omar, who is going to say some final comments. Thank you.
Yes, once again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Dr. Olomi, for your wonderful keynote presentation, and to our amazing panelists, Dr. Hanun and Dr. Hanifi, for such incredible wisdom. This was, again, day one of our Afghanistan Symposium. So, we took a deep dive into the history of Afghanistan and looking at how our past has shaped what we see today. And so tomorrow, on Tuesday, we are going to take a dive into the culture and the media. So we'll spend some time talking about the ways, journalism, news, music, social media, activism, how that has changed, especially within the last 20 years in Afghanistan. So hopefully it will be this was a great segue into tomorrow's keynote from Dr. Wajma Osman, who will be speaking to us with our wonderful panel in the evening. And then I also want to mention how important it is that we support scholars from Afghanistan as well. So the University of California, Riverside, UCR, is going to be working on sponsoring 2 scholars from Afghanistan to come to UCR to continue their work, to continue their research and be students here. So we will share more information on YouTube and on our social media about how you can donate. But we just want to ask you all to take that next step as you're watching this, as you're seeing these wonderful scholars, that you also help us with providing opportunities for more scholars, particularly those from Afghanistan, to come and continue their education. So we have a matching $100,000 match. The university is matching us by $100,000. So we can raise up to $200K if folks contribute. So please check that out. And we are once again just want to thank our audience, everyone, for tuning in. Please keep posted on our Twitter, on our Instagram for more information and to learn more about the conversations happening this week. And once again, I just want to thank everybody for joining, and we will see you all tomorrow. Have a wonderful night.